President Trump pushing ahead with his America First agenda.
Breaking news, Apple announced it's going to work with Foxconn to build a server factory in Texas by 2026.
The company says it is now planning to invest $500 billion in the U.S. economy.
The idea is come to America, build greatness in America.
Stargate shows people are listening to Mr. Trump's pitch to bring new industry to America.
Our country is on the verge of a comeback, the likes of which the world has never witnessed. America is back.
On April 2nd, at the White House South Lawn's Rose Garden, President Trump officially announced,
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
This moment, when President Trump declared Liberation Day, may well become a historic highlight for the United States. In this unprecedented press conference, President Trump unveiled a newly formulated tariff package. The U.S. will impose tariffs on most regions worldwide with unequal tax mechanisms, levying reciprocal tariffs on all countries. The starting rate is 10%, based on what President Trump previously described as currency manipulation and trade barriers imposed by other nations. Among them, a 34% tariff will be added to China on top of the existing 40% already imposed, bringing the cumulative export tariff on Chinese goods to the U.S. to 74%, far exceeding that of other countries. Earlier this year, upon taking office, the Trump administration first imposed a 20% tariff under the guise of countering fentanyl, and this time added another 34% on top of that 20%, plus the 20% from the first tariff war in 2018, totaling 74%. A 46% tariff will be imposed on Vietnam, primarily because too many Chinese goods are transshipped through Vietnam. Most Chinese products are simply repackaged in Vietnam and labeled as Vietnamese made. Vietnam must now close this loophole. Mexico faces a similar issue. Previously, President Trump had announced a 25% tariff on all foreign imported cars, effective midnight Eastern Time on April 3rd. Last month, he imposed a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. It remains unclear whether this is an additional measure to the general tariffs. One of the Trump administration's goals is to target overseas car companies. Last year, the U.S. imported about 8 million vehicles, with a trade value of approximately $240 billion, accounting for roughly half of total sales. Trump claims these measures will make foreign goods more expensive, benefiting American manufacturers and protecting jobs. Economists predict that these tariffs will lead to higher prices for American consumers purchasing a wide range of imported goods, as businesses pass on some or all of the increased costs. Affected products include beer, whiskey, tequila, maple syrup, fuel, avocados, and more. Companies may also reduce imports of foreign goods, which could in turn make existing products more expensive. This move has sparked significant reactions worldwide. China's Ministry of Commerce stated it firmly opposes the new U.S. tariffs and will take resolute countermeasures to safeguard its interests. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said she is prepared to take further action against the U.S. if negotiations fail. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, an ally of President Trump, publicly stated that the new U.S. tariffs on EU goods are wrong and warned that they benefit no one. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez vowed to protect Spanish workers and uphold open trade principles, suggesting Spain may take steps to mitigate the tariffs' impact. Irish Taoiseach Simon Harris called for a negotiated resolution. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese warned that these tariffs would ultimately raise costs for American consumers. Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney pledged retaliatory countermeasures, noting that the 25% U.S. tariff on cars would affect millions of Canadians. Brazil has gone further, passing a retaliatory law to directly confront U.S. trade policy. South Korea's industry minister announced in late March that an emergency response plan would be unveiled in April to shield its auto industry from economic fallout. Seoul stated that the tariffs directly threaten one of its largest export sectors. South Korea's acting president Han Duck-soo has ordered emergency aid for industries affected by the new U.S. tariffs, including the auto sector. He also directed the industry minister to negotiate with Washington and analyze the tariffs' impact. In discussions with senior officials, the acting president said, the government must pour all its capabilities to overcome the trade crisis. Additionally, he plans to meet with the private sector to discuss next steps. In essence, tariffs are a hidden tax on consumers, but only if they purchase affected goods. If tariffs drive up prices, consumers may switch to cheaper alternatives, avoiding direct costs. However, many free trade advocates have long overlooked this. While tariffs may protect domestic industries in the short term, trade barriers harm everyone, including American consumers, in the long run. They not only raise prices but also reduce efficiency and quality due to lack of competition. The U.S. auto industry in the 1970s is a prime example. Insulated from foreign competition, its quality suffered, whereas today, foreign manufacturers have driven U.S. cars' lifespan from 80,000 miles to 250,000 miles. Yet the crux of the issue is that trade partners have not opened their markets equally. Canada imposes 300% tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. The EU levies tariffs on U.S. cars 4 times higher than America's. Japan charges 154% on U.S. rice, and India imposes 100% tariffs on U.S. motorcycles, rates so high they act as de facto bans, blocking U.S. producers' market access. Ironically, these tariffs often burden U.S. sellers who absorb costs to remain competitive, effectively taxing American workers rather than the intended foreign consumers. The U.S. government's long-standing passive approach, avoiding reciprocal retaliation to prevent trade wars, has been foolish, as a trade war has long existed, with America simply not fighting back. This unequal trade status quo is unsustainable in the long term. Donald Trump's creative measures may bring a turning point, potentially ending or significantly reducing this one-sided disadvantage. In short, the U.S. must shift from passivity to assertiveness, adopting a tougher stance to address global trade inequities and protect its interests. Tariff strategies generally fall into 2 categories. The first targets specific bad behavior, such as tariffs on Canada and Mexico for allowing Chinese fentanyl smuggling into the U.S. This measure aims to force corrective action, with the clear message that tariffs will be lifted if the issue is resolved. Implemented in February this year against Canada and Mexico, its effects are not yet fully evident. The reason is obvious. Both economies heavily rely on the U.S. market. Data shows that the U.S., with 4% of the world's population, accounts for 26% of global GDP, yet exports make up only 10.8% of its GDP, underscoring its unique position as the world's largest consumer market. In contrast, the economic models of America's major trade partners differ starkly. Over half of Germany's economy depends on exports. Canada's exports account for 32% of its GDP, with 75% going to the U.S., and Mexico's exports constitute 39% of its economy, with 80% directed to the U.S. These nations' reliance on the U.S. market is clear, yet despite free trade agreements with the U.S., they fail to provide a level playing field. American sellers and workers face significant disadvantages in overseas markets, casting doubt on the true efficacy of so-called free trade. Moreover, the U.S. provides military protection to these trade partners, securing sea lanes China relies on, indirectly subsidizing German unions and Canadian healthcare, yet American companies cannot compete freely in their markets. Europe, with a larger population than the U.S., covers just 30% of its defense costs, further exacerbating this imbalance. Critics argue that beyond its constitution, the U.S. has never signed a truly free trade agreement, and the current trade system is seen as unjust. President Trump's tariff policy may mark the beginning of changing this dynamic, using economic leverage to correct long-standing trade imbalances. Post-World War II, the global landscape shifted dramatically, providing the backdrop for U.S. strategic policies. At the time, America's allies and former enemies had collapsed economies, and the U.S. accounted for 50% of global GDP, far exceeding today's 26%. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union emerged as a new threat, seeking to expand its influence over the next 45 years. In response, the U.S. rebuilt Europe and Japan's economies, established defensive alliances while bearing most of the costs, and extended its nuclear umbrella to allies. This commitment meant that if London or Tokyo faced a nuclear strike, the U.S. would retaliate against the USSR with equal force, even at the cost of New York or Los Angeles. Economically, the U.S. created an unequal global trade system to stimulate Allied growth, aiding their recovery from war and fostering self-reliance. This policy blended goodwill with strategy, hoping allies would regain military strength to bolster the alliance and using economic prosperity to curb communist infiltration. The strategy succeeded, ending the Cold War with a Western victory and the Soviet Union's collapse, easing global tensions after 45 years. Yet, 35 years after the Cold War's end, the U.S. still shoulders about 70% of Allied defense costs. Canada continues to restrict U.S. dairy farmers from its market, and trade barriers persist. The 1948 Berlin airlift exemplified U.S. aid that risked war, but does today's alliance still require such unequal sacrifice? The U.S. isn't against alliances or trade. Its Navy still secures global sea lanes, unmatched in history for promoting free trade. Yet analysts argue allies should no longer be treated as grown children, dependent on America, but as true partners in a balanced framework. Achieving trade balance may be simpler than imagined. If U.S. trade partners rely more on America's market than vice versa, and the U.S. commits to reciprocal tariffs, they'll have incentive to lower barriers. This approach has the backing of Argentine President Javier Milei, a libertarian and free trade advocate who's slashing government size at home and wants Argentina to lead in Trump's fair and reciprocal trade system. At the 2025 CPAC, Milei announced plans for a 0-0 trade deal with the U.S., no barriers on either side. If realized, it would be a global first, potentially pressuring other partners to cut tariffs to keep pace. Trump welcomed this, stressing it's not mercantilism, but mutual benefit. Analysts suggest the 0-0 deal with Argentina could become a testing ground for global free trade, challenging the current unequal system. Critics of Trump see his approach as overly aggressive, overlooking potential cooperation, while Milei is viewed as astutely grasping the strategy's essence. For Americans, President Trump's move makes skilled workers in traditional industries the biggest winners. Union members attending the event thanked Vice President J.D. Vance on the spot.
In West Virginia. Oh, great. So I hear all of Michigan. No way. You guys are so awesome.
I have watched my entire life, I have watched plant after plant after plant in Detroit and in the metro Detroit area close. There are now plants sitting idle. There are now plants that are underutilized, and Donald Trump's policies are going to bring product back into those underutilized plants. There's going to be new investment. There's going to be new plants built. And the UAW members, and I brought 20 of them with me, they're sitting right over here. We support Donald Trump's policies on tariffs 100%.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick of the Trump administration said,
You're going to see the greatest renaissance of manufacturing in America because we're tired of having them built in Taiwan. We're tired of having it built in South Korea. It's time for these things to be built in America.
White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller stated bluntly,
This is the great onshoring, the great reshoring of American jobs and wealth.
What are your thoughts? We welcome your comments and feedback. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.